Hey everybody, church, good to be with you. Been off for the last couple of weeks, but appreciate Ray and all the good work that he and Neil have been doing. I want to talk to you today from a passage of scripture that's one of my favorite in the entire New Testament, really in the entire Bible. Let me back up and give you a little bit of the context. I think it was about 5 years ago that I was going through a list of what we would call virtues. And it was actually a book that I was reading, put together by M. Scott Peck, the great psychiatrist, on the virtues. And there were about 70 to 80 virtues listed in this book. And I began asking myself, of all of those virtues, which seemed most cardinal or imperative for my soul? And of course, all the virtues are important, but which of these are kind of overarching virtues that I think really shape and format the human character? And one of the questions I asked was, what do I want for my children, who at the time were just small kids, elementary and early teen years? What do I want them to become as human beings? What do I want their character? How do I want their character to develop? Well, long short is I came up with 6 virtues that really, to me, stood out of all the rest. And a lot of the other virtues are kind of sub-virtues that kind of fall underneath these. But the 6 virtues that really stood out for me were, first of all, honesty. The second was curiosity. The third was courage. The fourth was humility. The fifth was gratitude. And the sixth was love. So I just said, knowing that I'm not there, but I said I would really love to be an incredibly honest, curious, courageous, humble, grateful, loving person. And of course, as I said, underneath all of those fit a lot of other sub-virtues. Specifically, the sub-virtue that I want to talk about today falls under the 6th of those virtues that I just mentioned, the virtue of love. And specifically, the virtue that I want to really address today is the virtue of generosity, or that of being a giving person, giving in every way. Dorothy Day, the great social worker that really started the Catholic social workers movement back in the 40s and 50s in New York City, said ultimately, when you go headlong with your heart into the act of giving, you ultimately find, if that process fully matures for you, you find that there's really no such thing as giving and receiving, that ultimately there's only sharing. In her work, she said, as she lost herself in it and really gave herself to it, she began to realize that the lines between giving and taking, givers and receivers, really were blurred by the beautiful process of love that ultimately yields a sharing. She said, echoing the words later of Mother Teresa, that some of the poorest people that she knew were the people who were actually on the giving side of things in the social workers movement. And some of the most magnanimous people she knew were those that were often finding themselves in immediate physical needs. Ultimately, Mother Teresa said years later that the poorest people she ever met were the people in the West, specifically in North America. Jesus spoke to that when Jesus said that actually it really is more blessed to give than it is to receive. Because as the giver, you have an abundance, you have an excess, whether that's time or money or talent. You have an excess that you have agency and decision-making power over. And it's a difficult thing to be in want. It's a difficult thing for all of us to turn our hands over. I remember my grandmother one time said to me when she was trying to give me something, and I can't remember if it was a compliment or a piece of clothing, but I was somewhat reticent to receive it. And my grandmother looked at me and said, "Would you please quit being selfish, Stan?" And I was curious to what she meant. And as was wont with my grandmother, she immediately told me, she said, Jesus said it's more important or more blessed to give than it is to receive. And she said, "You're always giving." And she said, "I think there's a selfishness in that. Have you ever thought that people might want to give to you? Have you ever thought that it might be good for them to experience abundance and to be able to have the gift of sharing abundance with you?" And so for a lot of us, we know that there is a selfishness in always being the giver. There is a selfishness in being unwilling to turn our hands over and allow other people to give into our lives, whether that's advice or, again, time or their talents. So ultimately, Day said, when we lose ourselves in the process of community, ultimately community yields a sharing, where we share the gifts of giving and receiving. And it's almost like east and west. You go far enough into the east and you end up west. You go far enough into the laughter and you end up in the tears, and far enough into the tears you end up in the laughter, and far enough into the giving and receiving that there's just an ultimate community of sharing. I think one of the best passages, or I don't think, in terms of 35 years of ministry, the passage that really, I think, stands out to me in all of Scripture, that I think brings this point of giving and receiving and communal sharing, that really brings it to light best, is a passage in 2 Corinthians, which again is one of my favorite books in the Bible. I've spoken from 2 Corinthians several times on this podcast. But the particular chapter is the 8th chapter and even into the 9th chapter. We probably won't get to the 9th chapter this week, but maybe next week we'll get there. Let me back up a little bit and give the context for 2 Corinthians. Corinth was a church Corinth was a city that had a Christian church located in the southern boot of Greece, the area called Achaia. Northern Greece, on the other side of that little Peloponnesian peninsula, or on the other side of the isthmus that connected Achaia to the mainland of Greece, was the region called Macedonia, named after Philip of Macedon. In Macedonia, for our purposes, Macedonia was the seat or the home of three churches that you know from the New Testament Scripture: Philippi, Thessalonica, and then the third one was the Berean church. Paul established the churches of Thessalonica, Philippi, Berea, probably several others, and the church of Corinth on his second missionary journey. For those that were raised in Sunday school, you remember Paul had 3 missionary journeys. He set out from Judea, the land of Palestine, and his first journey took him to what we now call Turkey, and he established the churches of Galatia, churches like Lystra, Derbe, Antioch of Iconium, Pisidia, the 4 or 5 churches there, the churches of Galatia that he later would write the book of Galatians to. After establishing those churches, he went back to Judea, he regrouped, and then he did a second missionary journey. The second missionary journey, he revisited those churches, and after revisiting those churches, he wanted to go up into what we would call northern Turkey. And you remember Paul had a vision, he had a dream, and in that dream, a man across the Aegean Sea, a man in Greece, Europe, actually pled for him to come and share the good news, the gospel with them there. And Paul woke up the next morning with that vision still in his brain and his heart, and he said the Spirit literally forbade him go up into northern Turkey and instead compelled him to go across the water, which he actually went across the top of the mainland into Greece. And so that's when he established the churches of Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, and then went on down to Athens and then on to Corinth and established the church there. So these churches were churches that Paul literally pastored. He didn't get to spend a lot of time there, but after establishing them, he went on with his journeys and he would write them letters. And so we get the letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians in that process. In 2 Corinthians, Paul dealt with a lot of things, but specifically in 2 Corinthians, Paul writes and gives some insight to a process that was very important to him, a venture, rather, that was very important to him, and that was the collection of an offering for the Christian church back in Judea. Now, again, a little bit of context that's important. In the earliest part of the Christian church, it didn't take long for denominations. I don't want to say factions because that sounds negative, but there literally were what would be the precedent or kind of a primordial development of what we now call denominations. Specifically, I think there were 2 large denominations in the early Christian church that were almost tantamount to what we now would call Catholic and Protestant. The first was the Jewish Christians who lived back in Judea, the people who came to Christ through the Hebrew religion. Jesus himself was a Jew, and so I don't know that Jesus came to establish another religion, but there were Jewish followers of Jesus. And then one of the early wrestlings, you remember, for the early Jewish followers was whether or not Gentile people, non-Jewish people, could become Christian. Pretty quickly, the Jewish Christians recognized that Jesus was not to be just cornered and kept by them. And so the gospel expanded to the Gentile world. 99% of the population of the earth now had access, they decided, to the gospel. Pretty quickly after that, though they decided that Gentile people could become Christians and become followers of Christ, there then became the concern, would they have to follow the same Jewish stipulations and guidelines, kind of the holiness standard, the religious standards of the Jewish people? Because the early Christian people who were Jewish still identified themselves as Jewish. You remember when Paul, in the last part of the book of Acts, went back to Jerusalem for the final time before he went on to Rome, where he would later die. When Paul went to Jerusalem, the Bible said he went there and he went to the temple to make sacrifices. So he was still very much a Jewish man, and he followed kosher law. But the question was, the Gentile people who were not indigenous to Palestine, Judea, who were not a part of the Hebrew family, would they also have to follow those same religious distinctives? And ultimately, Paul and the early church leaders decided that they wouldn't. Now, the process that I just explained in 3 minutes was a very difficult process. And some of the same friction and tension and antipathy that exist in the factions and denominations or between denominations of Christianity today obviously existed back then. And some of the arguments, some of the process became quite strident and painful. With that in mind, the Apostle Paul always himself, though a Jew, experienced a lot of tension with the church in Judea. And I'm not sure if the tension was actually in the people, the Judean Jewish Christians, or if it was in Paul's own heart, because you might remember Paul himself, as a Pharisee, had been a persecutor of the early Christian church. And after being a persecutor of the early Christian church, was converted to the very group of people that he had persecuted. And this created quite a tension. Paul had been responsible for a genocide of Christian people. You remember his conversion happened on the road to Damascus when he was going to Damascus to persecute the Christian church. The Bible says in the previous chapter, that Acts 8 and 9, that Paul literally commandeered the movement that drugged people out of their homes and took them ultimately to their death. The first Christian martyr, Stephen, died at the behest of this man named Saul of Tarsus, who would later become Paul. Actually, the Bible's pretty technical or clear when it says, as they were stoning Stephen, as he was being killed, Saul literally stood holding the garments of those, his minions, who actually did the stoning. He didn't sully his hand with the bloody rocks, but he held the garments of those who did. So you can imagine after he was converted that a lot of the early Jewish Christians were dubious to him. They were very deeply concerned that maybe he was feigning, a conversion to Trojan horse the early church. Through that process, Paul actually, and I think this was wise on the part of the Spirit, Paul actually was called away from the Jewish Christians in Judea, and he was called to be a light and a proclaimer of the gospel to the Gentile world, which makes complete sense because the early Christian people had every right to have anxiety about this man. So instead of staying with them, he went off on these journeys and he established churches in these Gentile regions like Asia Minor and Greece. One of the things, though, that Paul did amongst the churches of Greece and what we would now call Turkey, one of the things he did with these churches that he oversaw was he asked them on his first and second journey if they would be willing to collect an offering, to raise an offering for their brothers and sisters back in Judea. We don't know all the details, but what we do know is that the churches in Judea were experiencing severe deprivation. It was probably as a result of persecution. And the deprivation was of such a fevered pitch that Paul wanted to do something to help them. And so he reached out to the Gentile Christians that he oversaw, and he said, I would like you for the space of a year, maybe 2 years, the in-between space between my second and third missionary journeys. I'll be coming back to you, but while I'm gone, I want you over the course of that year to 2 years, to every week set aside a little bit of what you have for your brothers and sisters who are hurting back in Israel, back in Judea. And when I come on my third missionary journey, I will collect that from you and I will take it. I think there was a lot in, number one, I think the need was certainly there, and I think the reason for the offering was first and foremost that it was needed on behalf of the Judeans. But I also think there was some strategy in the offering. I think Paul was taking an offering, again, if it were today, from Protestants to Catholics, from progressives to conservatives, from Methodist to Baptist. This was a way for Paul to cross denominational lines, to cross the tension that might develop between factions, and allow one part of the church that may not have been fully respected by another part of the church to allow that part of the church to give lovingly as a proof of their love, as a proof of their union. And I think there may have even been some personal psychology for Paul. I think it may have been a way for Paul, who had persecuted the church, to assuage his own guilt and maybe to vindicate his own love for the Judean Christians that he had once harmed, that he couldn't serve directly. If he could bring back this magnanimous gift of the Gentiles, who were looked on again with doubt and dubiety by the Jewish Christians, if he could come with an offering, even by his own hand, it would be his way of trying to bring some sense of fuller peace and a settled sense of union between these two factions of the Christian church. So, 2 Corinthians is written between Paul's second and third journey. He's already established the need of the offering with the Corinthian church, and now he's sending a letter months in advance of his next trip there. And in the letter that he sends to the Corinthians to prepare them for his coming and to remind them of this offering that they had committed to, Paul says some things that I've been chewing on for years, and I just wanted to enumerate to you on that, on the foundation of that context. So I'll just read through 2 Corinthians 8, and I'll point out some things that I've seen there. And I love that Neil calls these messages not sermons or preaching, but he calls them conversation starters. Because some of the statements that are made here are so provocative. Again, I've been chewing on them for decades now. I don't think they end the conversation about distribution of means. I don't think they end the conversation about political and economic, geopolitical, structures. I don't think they settle those arguments, but I think they bring some insight and at least lead us into the conversation thoughtfully. So this is what Paul says to the Corinthians as he's preparing to come to them. He said, I want you to know, this is 2 Corinthians 8, verse 1, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that has been granted to the churches in Macedonia. Now remember, he's talking to the Corinthians about their brothers and sisters to the north in Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. And he describes what has happened in Macedonia in those churches as the bestowing or the granting of grace on the churches of Macedonia. Now, what does he mean by grace has been bestowed upon those churches? Verse 2. He says, for during a severe ordeal of affliction. Now remember, he's talking about the offering that he's receiving for the Christians in Judea. And he's talking about the offering that he's specifically receiving from the Philippians, the Thessalonians, and the Bereans. But he's describing the offering that they're giving and the act of their giving as a grace from God that has been bestowed upon them in their own severe ordeal of affliction. That's another thing Dorothy Day said. She said perhaps the most profound giving that she ever saw was not the giving of those who possessed means to those who didn't, but the most profound giving was the giving that happened out of deprivation, the giving that happened between people who had so little to give. Paul said, during a severe ordeal of affliction, the Macedonians' abundant joy mixed with their extreme poverty and overflowed in a wealth of generosity. It's amazing. Paul literally writes an equation here. And he said, speaking of the Macedonians, a severe ordeal of their own affliction, plus their own abundant joy. I remember when I was coming back from Haiti a few years ago, my son, who's now 21, was, I think, 15 at the time, and I had taken him to Haiti. We had worked on the ground in an area right on the Dominican border, a city called Wanamint. UNICEF years ago did a study, I think it was probably 15 years ago, found in Wanamint that there was a period there where 51% of the children under the age of 12 in Wanamint were HIV positive. The deprivation there was so severe. But we went and we did work with an incredible place, an orphanage school called Danita's Children. And I wanted my son to be exposed to another part of the world that was very different from the world, the bubble that he had grown up in there in South Nashville in Tennessee. And I remember on the way back, we were on the plane, my son was looking out the window, and I wanted to talk to him a little bit and reflect on the trip. And I said, was there anything that really stood out to you on the trip? 2 or 3 things, maybe. As we go back to our abundance, and as we go back to our siloed wealth and all of the things that we have, what struck you about what you just saw? And immediately I was thinking about, the scenes of deprivation that my mid-teenage boy had been exposed to. He didn't immediately respond. I remember he kept looking out the window, and the silence lasted long enough that I thought he hadn't heard me. And I said, "Hey, bub, I was wondering," and before I get the question out the second time, he kindly said, "Dad, I heard you, I'm just thinking." And after letting him think for a little while longer, thinking that, we'd kind of moved beyond the question and an answer, he finally spoke up, and I'll never forget, he said one word. He said, "Laughter." And I was curious now. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "It was the laughter that stood out the most to me." And I almost immediately knew what he was talking about, because as I reflected on our 7 or 8 days there, I did recall that there was an amazing amount of laughter. I mean, the kids playing soccer in the street, kids that were outside of the orphanage, outside of the school where we worked, kids that the folk who worked there said probably ate a meal on average every 2 days, 1 meal every 2 to 3 days. These kids had made a ball out of duct tape and socks. They had made their own soccer ball. But I remember just the hilarious laughter, just the fun that they were having in the midst of all of that deprivation. There was a deprivation in terms of money, in terms of food, and perhaps medical resources, but they were like the Macedonians. Paul said the equation was, during a severe ordeal of their own affliction, their abundant joy. My son said the thing that stood out was their laughter. I just can't imagine that there could be that much happiness there. Their severe ordeal of affliction mixed with their abundant joy, and then Paul doubles back and says, plus their extreme poverty. So the poverty must have been the result of some persecution, some external affliction. Affliction plus internal joy plus extreme poverty has overflowed, equal sign. Do you see it? Has overflowed or yielded a wealth of generosity on their part. Not a wealth of money or means or physical things, but it's somehow yielded a wealth of generosity on their part. For as I can testify, the Macedonians voluntarily, well, that's key, voluntarily, out of their own heart, gave according to their means. And then Paul pauses and says, yes, even beyond their means. Listen to this. Begging us earnestly for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints in Jerusalem. A group of people that in the midst of their own affliction and poverty maintained an abundant joy that yielded generosity. The Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy 6 told Timothy, he said, warn those who desire to be rich. Interesting. He didn't say warn those who are rich. He said warn those who desire to be rich. Warn those who set their minds simply on temporal, physical things. Warn them, if they desire to be rich, that they might pierce themselves through with many sorrows. That's the same chapter that Paul went on and said, for it's the love of money that's the root of all evil. It's not money that's the root of all evil, it's the love of money. And interestingly, I think there is a danger in having an abundance of things, but I think there's also a danger in having a lack of things. I've known a lot of rich people in this world who were some of the most giving people I know and who were not possessed by the thing they had. And then I've known people who were absent of means, who were incredibly poor in this world, who were possessed with the idea of money. I think about the long lines that sometimes stretch, watching people who struggle for a meaningful wage, spending their money on a lottery ticket. I mean, pouring their money into something on just the chance, the famed chance that they might be rich. The reality is you can be pierced with sorrow by money, either in the possession of it or the absence of it. Whether it's monetary gluttony and obesity or it's monetary anorexia and bulimia, either of those are possessed by the idea of money. The reality is that you can be incredibly ungenerous as a wealthy person, and you can be incredibly generous, Paul says here, as a person who's experienced a lot of deprivation. Generosity does not demand abundance in terms of means. Generosity simply demands an abundance of joy, an abundance of love, an abundance of perspective. Listen to the perspective of the Macedonians. Paul said they not only gave according to their means, they gave beyond their means, and they begged us for the privilege of sharing in this ministry to the saints. I love the fact that Paul agreed with Dorothy Day. He doesn't even call it giving. He just calls it sharing. And he says these folk had such a perspective that they begged for the opportunity to do this. I also like the fact that he said they gave according to their means, and then he paused and said they even gave beyond their means. They gave, verse 5, not merely as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then by the will of God to us, so that we might urge Titus that as he had already made a beginning with the offering, they had talked about the offering for some months before, so he also should complete this generous undertaking among you. Now, as you excel in everything, to the church at Corinth now, he says, you're excellent in everything. You're excellent in faith. You got all the doctrine stuff. You're excellent in speech. You say all the right things. You're excellent in knowledge. You know the right things. But now I urge you to be excellent with utmost eagerness, to excel also in this generous undertaking. I'm telling you, I think I spent the first half of my life trying to excel in faith, in knowledge, and speech. And as I tip the crest of the hill into the second half of life, and maybe I don't even have a whole other half. Things are getting a whole lot simpler for me these days. I'm always open to learning more, and I'm open to having my faith developed, but I feel less like talking these days. I appreciate the opportunity to do this, but even this feels very hollow to me, except that it's buoyed, except that there's a bullion beneath the currency of talk, and that bullion is just the simple action of my life. Just looking for opportunities in every place, in every pulpit of life, to excel not just in talking and thinking and knowing and believing, but to excel in the undertaking of generosity. To look for opportunities to redistribute the advantages, the abundance, the gifts of my life with others. In verse 8, Paul said, listen, I'm not saying this as a command, but I'm actually just testing the genuineness of your love. Bottom line is, and James would say it later, the brother of Jesus would say, faith without works is dead. I mean, what are you going to do? In 1 John, John said, you're going to go up to the guy in the ditch and say, be well, be filled, be whole, and like share a gospel tract with him? No. He said, if you tell the guy just, religious platitudes and you leave him in the ditch, how does the love of God dwell in you? In Matthew 25, that quintessential text about Judgment Day for all of us, Jesus says it well when he says he looks at the folk on the right and he doesn't say well believed, well read, well understood, well known. He says, well done. You did some things. I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was a stranger, I was naked, I was a prisoner, and you took care of me. Well done, not well didn't. I remember when I used to think religion and spirituality was all the things that we didn't do. Remember the old phrase, I don't drink, I don't chew, and I don't date girls who do. We really thought, man, the things we were against, that's holiness. But ultimately, it really just comes down to, Jesus said, love your neighbor as you love yourself. Don't love them more, don't love them less. Love them in such a way that there's no giver and there's no receiver. There's just a sense of shared mutuality. Paul said, this is not a command, but I'm testing the genuineness of your love against the earnestness of others. That might chafe, some of us a little bit. It might even feel manipulative, and maybe it was, for Paul to speak to the Corinthians and to hold up this example of the Macedonians. Maybe the Corinthians could look at Paul and say, we've got a different situation than the Macedonians. Their story is their story. Don't try to guilt us into being like them. But Paul didn't feel that way. Paul felt like he had seen something very genuine and very earnest in the Macedonians, and he wanted to hold them up as an example to the Corinthians. And finally, and this is where we'll pick up next week, Paul says, for you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, generosity, that though he was rich, remember the incarnation, remember Philippians 2, who being in the form of God thought it not robbery. I love that line from the King James. Who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to humble himself. He was not humbled. This was not an external pressure. He humbled himself. It was an impulsion, not a compulsion. He humbled himself, and he came and lived among us, suffering even the death of the cross. This is, in theological terms, called the kenosis, or the pouring out. But in Christian theology, Jesus didn't pour out his godness. He didn't pour out his deity. He simply poured out the rights and privileges of that deity, distributing them, Paul said, amongst us, sharing in our suffering. Now we have not a high priest, the writer of Hebrews said, who's untouched by the feelings of our infirmities, but in all points has come and been like us. For you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ. Listen to this, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. At that point, Paul, who's held up the Macedonians as an example for the Corinthians to aspire to, now holds up Jesus as a prime example, a prime testimony to a life of generosity. And Paul says, he became poor that we might become rich. And in this matter, I'm giving my advice. It is appropriate for you who began last year not only to do something, but even to desire to do something. It is important for you who desired to do it. You made the pledge. Now finish doing it so that your eagerness may be matched by completing it according to your means. For if the eagerness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has. Listen to this. I remember we used to be asked in this religious setting that I lived in, we used to be asked to give pledges that we didn't have, to somehow have faith and say if we made the pledge that the money would come into us. And I mean, we almost played God like a roulette table, that if we played our cards right, there was this prosperity that would come to us and it would allow us to give. So we pledged we pledged and put things on our credit card and paid high interest on it, hoping in faith that somehow money would come our way. Paul says, don't do that. I don't want you to give beyond your means. I want you to give according to your means. For the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what they don't have. I'm not asking you to give something you don't have. And then Paul mitigates our responsibility or lowers our responsibility from the responsibility of Jesus. He actually does. You remember he says Jesus became poor that we might be rich. And Paul says, I'm not asking you to do that. If Jesus did that, then Jesus did that, but that's above and beyond the call of duty, and you don't have to do that. Verse 13, he says, I don't mean that there should be relief for others and pressure on you. I'm not asking that you give it all away and become poor that they might be rich. I don't want them to be relieved and you now to have pressure, because then what are we going to do? Put the responsibility on them to give it all back to you? No, Paul said, this is all I want. I simply want there to be a fair balance between your present abundance and their present need, so that their abundance may one day be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance or equality for all. I'll end with this week. This is the conversation starter. Paul said, at the heart of love is this idea of being concerned, valuing another human being. And Paul said, how can we, who are supposed to be a part of one another and one with the other, how can we in one area experience such abundance while other parts of us, parts immediate to us, parts that are deeply and intrinsically connected to us, are suffering? At the heart of the Spirit's development of love in us, I think, is a consternation, an inner heartburn, a troubling of soul at the misdistribution of means and good that surrounds us, the inequality, the suffering of others in the midst of abundance. I think this is a major question, and one conversation will never has, never will completely satisfy this question. But what does it mean to be truly generous? What does it mean to truly live as human beings, as a species, a life of complete sharing, where our abundance can satisfy the needs of others and their abundance can satisfy our needs, until we truly are one? This is the issue that Paul's addressing, and some of the really good stuff is yet to come. So I'll pick up there in a week or so And I hope this has been a good conversation started for you to go chew on. And I want you to know I really, really, really love you. Ray, Neil, and all of us here at Everybody Church are thankful and deeply honored to be a part of you guys' life. All right, we'll see you again soon.